Hello and a very Merry Christmas from me, Michael Simmons, and everyone at Reality Check. I'm really proud of this new show that we launched in just October. So I wanted to use this Christmas episode to go over some of the highlights from the show and some of my appearances on Spectator TV this year before the Hogmanay bells ring in 2026. We were really chuffed with our launch episode of Reality Check because we managed to secure the famous American economist Arthur Laffer. He was so full of energy when he came into the studio. I was kind of awestruck just to be sat opposite him. He explained the history behind his famous Laffer curve and how a staggeringly high tax burden is killing Britain. Here's some highlights.
The US, I guess, might be making some headway, but it's harder to make that case in Britain. Our overall tax burden is heading for a post-war high, even if individual taxes on sort of middle earners are actually relatively low to where they've been in the past. You said we're on the wrong side of that. Yeah. Two questions. What would be the optimal tax rate on the Laffer curve for Britain? And given that we're about to have this budget that's going to massively raise taxes again, how far wrong are we?
Let me just say the optimal is so far away from anything we are talking about right now. It's just, I mean, what you do know is the higher tax rates are, the more likely an increase will lead to less revenues. The lower rates are, the more likely an increase will lead to more revenues. You also know the larger the tax base, the more likely an increase will lead to more revenues. The smaller the tax base, the less likely it'll lead to more. So there are lots of things in here, and there are lots of taxes out there. There are literally thousands of taxes in Britain, and so you can't say what is the optimal rate. But what you want to look at here is, when you look at the burden of taxation, you don't want to look at taxes over GDP, let's say. Yeah. Because the taxes have reduced the GDP. The burden is really much, much worse than that. You've destroyed the prosperity. If you look at Britain's GDP as a share of the world, 50 years ago it was high. It's gone way, way down. You are disappearing. This is the land of the Industrial Revolution. This is the land of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. This is the land of entrepreneurs. Capitalism, if you're up in Scotland, it's all the Presbyterians were with, here we are, we're capitalists, we're a religion. This is the country that discovered the modern world of good faith. It's lost it.
You think Britain's really lost its way?
Well, of course it has lost its way. It's really terrible. I watch what's going on. And, after the Gordon Brown 40 to 50p, what does Cameron do? He lowers it to 45p. What? He should lower it to 35p. What you need to do is cut a big shakeup, break some of the furniture, break some of the china, and really get a new start on the whole tax structure. And you need to get control of the government by a good political focus on economics.
Among Arthur's arguments is that taxing the wealthy people never achieves its aims. It's just counterproductive. Funnily enough, in the days and weeks that followed that interview, protesters, including the Green Party leader Zach Polanski, were gathering around Westminster and outside the Treasury to argue that billionaires should be abolished.
But the top 1% already pay something like a third of all income tax. Aren't they already paying their fair share?
Well, what we're here today to talk about is a series of taxes that are not to do with income tax. We're here to talk about things like a 2% tax on people that have assets of over £10 million per year. That actually only affects, the estimate is about 20,000 people. So we're talking about a really tiny number of people, potentially contributing a little bit more to make society fairer and to improve our public services. And also things that just don't make any sense, like why do we pay, why is the rate of capital gains tax in this country the lowest in the G7? At the moment, Rishi Sunak, who is as rich as the king, in 2022, he paid the same effective tax rate as a nurse because of how little we tax the income gained from wealth, from things like selling shares. That just doesn't make sense. And I think a lot of people in this country understand that that doesn't make sense, which is why wealth taxes are actually incredibly popular amongst the general public. And it's why young people particularly, they're looking at the world they're inheriting and they're saying, do you know what? This isn't fair. We already pay our fair share.
Zach, can you give one quick comment to Reality Check? There's no evidence that wealth taxes work, is there?
We will end Rip-Off Britain, and we will make sure that the very wealthiest pay more tax.
Are you not misleading these young people? There's no evidence that wealth taxes work.
Zach doesn't want to speak to Reality Check, but he can watch our earlier episode, and if he's got any evidence that this will bring in the 24 billion he says it would, then we'd like to hear it. The Treasury collects data on the proportion that the wealthy pay in tax, the proportion all of us pay in tax, and it's really interesting if we take a look at the top 1%. For years, they've been paying something like 28% of all income tax. If you include other taxes, it gets something like a third of tax. But the latest projection suggests that that number is going to fall to about 27%, somewhere between 26 and 27%. So first things first, despite us increasing our taxes on the wealthy, it's not doing what the protesters want. It's reducing the share paid by the wealthy. And that's partly because of this evidence that the richest taxpayers are leaving.
In the end, Rachel Reeves resisted those calls to directly tax the wealthy, but instead she's put the pressure on the rest of us by bringing the tax burden to an all-time high, thanks in no small part to her freezes of the thresholds for income tax. When that budget was announced, I gave my instant reaction. Let's take a look.
Now, you can see from the graph we're showing of the market that it sort of fluctuated a bit, it went down, it shot up. But kind of once the measures sunk in, the market, in fairness to the Chancellor, seems to have reacted fairly well. The gilt yield, which affects our borrowing costs, as I say, is coming steadily down at the time we're recording this reality check. Well, why is that? It's because of the headroom, the margin of error that the Chancellor has managed to leave herself with at the end of this budget. After her first budget and after the spring statement, she left herself with just £9.9 billion margin of error. And that, rumours said, were quickly eroded by changes in the gilt market, by the cost of borrowing, by U-turns on policy measures. And in the run-up, we were reporting and we were briefed that this was going to leave her with a black hole of something like 20 to 30 billion pounds. Now, luckily for the Chancellor, that seems to have not actually materialised. And to everyone's shock, including mine, the dent to her headroom was only £6 billion, which is what has made it possible for her to get it back up to £22 billion, a much bigger margin, which seems to have given confidence to the markets. But she's got there in pretty difficult ways for all of us in the economy. She's done it with some pretty major tax rises that we'll discuss in a bit. But actually, inflation has bizarrely helped her too. The OBR are pretty clear that kind of offsetting the productivity downgrade that we were warned about for weeks and weeks, they've managed to take so much tax from workers because of inflation pushing up people's pay. And obviously, for the top workers, 40% of your income just goes straight to the tax man, that inflationary boost to pay has helped the Chancellor and meant her fiscal black hole was much smaller than originally thought. So let's look at the budget measures themselves. The headline today will be the shambolic leaking of the budget. I mean, make no mistake, someone in the Office for Budget Responsibility will lose their job over this. This just really is an unprecedented scandal. But if we ignore that and look for the headlines in what was leaked and what was then eventually announced in the House of Commons, for me, it's a benefits budget paid for by workers. We don't see any cuts to welfare spending. In fact, when we look at disability benefit spending, it's going to hit £109 billion. That's an increase of over £9 billion compared to where we were in the spring, which includes the U-turn on the winter fuel payment, the U-turns on the benefits cuts, and uprating of benefits. The government just seems to have given up on trying to solve the worklessness crisis. To pay for all that, she's using £26 billion of tax hikes. Now, that's going to take the tax as a share of GDP, what we call the tax burden, to a record high, to levels we've just not experienced since the Second World War. Now, she says she's not breaking her manifesto commitment because she's done this without touching the rates of the big free taxes. But I would say
if she's not broken the letter of the manifesto commitment, she's certainly broken the spirit, because there's massive increases on tax on all of this. She's done this by extending the threshold freeze on income tax. So the point at which you start paying tax at all and the point that you go into higher tax brackets, she's keeping those flat, which means as inflation rises, as inflation pushes people's wages up, more people are going to get dragged into tax and into higher tax brackets. The OBR say it's going to result in an additional nearly 800,000 people who currently don't pay any tax paying tax at all. So it's, it's just ridiculous to claim that this is not a tax-raising budget on workers, because hundreds of thousands of people are going to be stung by these threshold freezes. In fact, if you look at the effect of these freezes since the Tories began them, it means over 5 million people either paying tax for the first time or paying them in higher brackets. We really are in a country that is just continually hiking tax. All of this has an effect on our borrowing costs, the big core problem at the heart of Britain's economy. And there was bad news there too. The spending measures and everything announced by Rachel Reeves, according to the OBR, is going to push this up, as the graph that I'm looking at now shows. We're going to be spending something like nearly £69 billion more on borrowing than had been originally forecast. And you and I'm afraid to say, are going to have to start paying for that. There's something interesting, though, about how she's put all the pieces together, how she's got the OBR to count her chickens. If you look at when these measures are set to come in, most of the spending increases will happen because they start this year or they start in the next financial year. But the tax increases that she's using to pay for them, many of them fall either in the year of the next election or the year just before. Now, can we really imagine that a Labour government, which so far at least is struggling in the polls, is going to go into the election year having to deliver these tax rises? So I think there has to be a degree of scepticism when we look at these OBR numbers. Has she sort of tricked the OBR with tax rises that she plans to not have to deliver so that she can make spending commitments now, to increase those benefits now, to scrap the two-child lock that pleases so many of her backbenchers that now control, unfortunately, I would say, almost everything she does? If the markets come to my view on that this is a bit of an accounting wheeze and that she doesn't really intend to deliver a lot of the tax rises that she's told the OBR she will, then we could see gilt yields going in the wrong direction quite quickly. If you remember when Labour were elected, they were pretty clear that growth was the most important thing. Everything this government did was going to be about growth, we were told. It's what they were to be judged on. Well, the OBR have been pretty clear today on that they're failing. They say that growth this year is revised upwards compared to their previous estimate, but for every subsequent year of the forecast, they've revised it down. So that means the measures that were leaked today, that Reeves announced today, are making us grow slower than we otherwise would have. And the most important one for me, inflation, the cost of living. In all of Reeves' briefing before the budget, she said that was going to be her focus. But again, she's failed. The OBR have upgraded their forecast for inflation both this year and next year. So she's making the cost of living worse, not better. Talking about the budget can get a bit statsy and frankly a bit boring though. So I was really pleased that the episode we recorded before the budget, and actually probably one of the favourite episodes we've done on this show, there was no numbers at all. Instead, our deputy political editor, James Heal, sat down with me and we tried 11 drinks that chancellors have drank while delivering their budgets. It was really fun to record, although I had a bit of a sore head the next day. Let's take a look. Is Reeves really in a sort of historically unique situation? She, as I said at the start of this episode, she constantly refers to things like Brexit, the pandemic, Ukraine, and she says, the world is changing. But surely all these drinks and all the chancellors they represent could say that they were in a unique time.
Yeah.
Is it just an excuse?
I think that a lot of the excuses are very commonplace, and we've seen some of the sort of rhymes and echoes throughout all this, Michael. I do think, though, there is that question of, was it George Bush Senior, the vision thing? What's the vision? And I was sat there in the Chancellor's briefing 2 weeks ago in that Tuesday morning press conference at 8:15. I started thinking, what is to stop you doing the exact same thing in 12 months' time? And it is the kind of question about the doom loop.
Yeah.
How do we break out of that? And it is striking that we've had a few long-serving chancellors, and I do think, to be fair, you need a chancellor with a long-term tenure and a vision. But maybe Osborne, Brown, and Lawson would be the exceptions over the last sort of 40 years or so. But it's where we've had tax reform, left wing. This isn't a left-right wing issue. People like Dan Needle, a Labour member, but also someone who's very good on tax, will say you've got things like the 100k cut-off cliff, and it sort of penalise you earning over that. So in terms of Reeves, it's a classic 6 of 1 half question, which is that, yes, she's had a difficult inheritance, but she played a bad hand badly.
Sure.
And that is why people can see that as we get further and further away from the last election, and she owns more and more of what's happened since, she owns the responsibility for that. And of course, she had the budget last year. She'll have this budget as well. But there's also things such as stated priorities versus revealed preferences. So things such as she says, growth my number one priority. Well, of course, the obvious answer to that, as we saw, for instance, on the other side, the Tories, the Brexit stuff, hang on a sec, your own government forecast says that this will not boost growth or employment.
And they're doing inconsistent things, right?
On the employment rates,
yeah. Like as I wrote about in last week's magazine, how can you say that you're only doing pro-growth things and then bringing in an employment rights bill, for
as we
example,
have Paul Johnson on
that your own government, that your own impact assessment is going to say cost businesses £5 billion. But we're going to stop the cameras before we embarrass ourselves. But before we do that, I've got two questions. The first is the obvious one. Of all the drinks we've tasted, and I guess the chancellors they represent, which is your favourite?
I think of all of these, I'm not saying I'm sort of... It's a difficult one, isn't it? It's a properly sort of, when I was a Sunday hack, it was a kill your babies thing on a Saturday, which is like you got to slaughter some of your favourites. But I'm going to go for the original. I'm going to go for Dizzy. I'm going to go for Benjamin Disraeli, and I'm going to say that I think that was my favourite one.
Okay, and our final question is, as you said earlier, Steer Pike sadly revealed that Rachel Reeves is not going to be reviving the drinking tradition. She will just be having... It might not even be mineral water. It'd be water out of one of the House of Commons water fountains. But
Eau de Thames, as one person in the cafeteria told me that. Eau de Thames, yeah.
But if we were in a different world where drinking at work was still accepted at places that weren't just Fleet
The
Street,
Spectator.
what do you think the Chancellor's drink would be?
Well, I'm told that her favourite drink is the Aperol Spritz. So of these, I'm not necessarily sure which would grab her. Of these, probably the gin and tonic, maybe the white wine and a bit of Malvern water. But I do think probably a white wine. I think that will be her chosen choice. Sort of the drink of such professionals everywhere.
Reeves probably would have quite liked to drink, given the year she's had. And I think she actually provided the biggest moment, not just in economics, but in politics this year. And that was when she was seen upset at Prime Minister's questions, and the guilt yield spiked because they thought that she was going to be fired. It was really a dramatic moment. So dramatic, in fact, that we did a quick reaction episode of Coffee House Shots. It's worth reminding ourselves.
Michael, Isabel there mentions, of course, the fact that there were two tears rolling down Rachel Reeves' cheeks, perhaps a very different type of two-tier care we're used to. But also, how was the bond markets reacting to all of this? Because there's been some talk online of sort of tiers of gold in terms of the effect on the UK markets.
The bond yields in terms of all of them, the 5, the 30-year have all jumped up. The 10-year borrowing cost is on course for its biggest one-day rise since October 2022. And James, you'll remember very well that was during the Truss premiership. In terms of what's going on here, it's always a bit difficult to really work out why traders buy and sell in the way they do. Speaking to people, the suggestion seems to be that at the start of PMQs, they took this as a signal that the Chancellor was sort of imminently either going to resign or be sacked, as we've discussed. And I think as much as markets would be critical of a lot of the stuff that the Chancellor has done since she's been in number 11, they would see the Chancellor being removed, as yet another unstable, destabilising thing. I mean, Rachel Reeves
is quite sound, actually, at least in what she wants to do in terms of fiscal policy. I mean, she said in 2015 that the Labour Party was not the party for those on benefits. She'll be upset that we've reminded people of that. And even though I think personally the reforms they wanted to make to the welfare system don't go far enough in terms of the fiscal challenge that we're facing, it was still, seen as at least an acknowledgement that the government accepts we have a fiscal problem and they want to do something about it. And markets seeing that her potentially being removed for that seems to be why the borrowing costs jumped. If it is because of that, then we can expect them kind of to fall down again tomorrow. But if there's something, more structurally that's being missed, then these costs are going to go higher and higher. And to be honest, it's worse news than it normally would be for any chancellor to have borrowing costs going up. Because just yesterday, the OBR sort of reviewed their assessment, reviewed their forecasts that they always make at budgets and so forth. And they found that looking 5 years ahead, which is crucial because looking 5 years ahead is how you judge if the fiscal rules are being met, that they've been underestimating how much the government borrows by sort of enough to wipe out the headroom. So that already dented the headroom. The U-turn on the benefits cuts is going to take a chunk out of the headroom. And now we've got even higher borrowing costs. So, whatever Rachel Reeves was upset about, she's going to be a lot more upset come the autumn.
But why were the gilt markets so volatile? Why did this bit of Westminster theatre set them off? We've talked about this a lot, and actually we did a cover story on it this year called The Coming Crash. And Freddie Gray, our deputy editor, interviewed myself and one of Britain's leading economists, Paul Johnson. He explained what's going on.
I mean, the reason I think that the rate in the UK is at high levels at the moment is for exactly the reasons that we've been talking about. We have a persistently high deficit. We've got a very high debt, and it has become evident that this government, like the last one, just can't cut some of the things that we've been talking about. If you can't make a small cut to pensioner fuel allowances, and you can't slightly slow the increase in the rate of growth of disability benefit payments, then it looks like you can't do very much. We've had a spending review, which has fixed spending for the next 2 or 3 years, and we're coming up to a budget where the government is really hemmed in terms of the tax changes it can make. And the tax changes it can make if it wants money. I mean, a lot of the things that we've seen, all these kites that are being flown, lots of things on housing taxation. Well, we do need to change housing taxation, but my goodness, let's put capital gains tax on big properties. Let's slam landlords some more. I mean, this isn't a way to think about it. Let's think about what we should be doing with stamp duty. Let's think about what we should be doing with council tax. Let's think about how we can change the relationship between renting and owner occupation, which is currently vastly favourable to owner occupation relative to renting, rather than sticking an additional tax. I mean, that's just one example. And we've had yet again speculation about changing the taxation of pensions, which caused all sorts of damage in the run-up to the last budget and will cause all sorts of damage in the run-up to this budget. So I'm afraid this looks a little bit like a government which is flailing around and causing damage by flailing around in terms of some of the tax things that are being suggested, because it doesn't have a clear view of where it wants to go or how it wants to get there.
And it looks a little bit, to me anyway, as though, sticking with you, Paul, that when Labour are feeling panicked about the economy, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer will discuss something, they'll have a meeting, and they'll come out and they will double down. I think this is what's going on with the landlords this week. They will double down on what Tories would call the politics of envy. They would double down on this idea that we're going to be bold enough to go after people that we regard as privileged or comfortable. And that's not necessarily a sensible economic strategy.
Yeah, as I say, the taxation of housing is a complicated beast. It's really important we get it right. We currently got it disastrously wrong. We massively undertax people who live in big houses, and we massively overtax people who buy big houses, which is just the worst of all possible worlds in many ways. So it certainly needs sorting out. But simply pouring more tax on landlords, as actually happened in the last budget, when stamp duty, unbelievably, on landlords was increased, as you suggested earlier on, will it have the result of increasing rents because there'll be a reduced supply in the end of housing for rent. So it's really important to get these right. Now, it's also worth saying in terms of getting tax from better off people that the last Conservative government was the most socialist government we've seen in decades in terms of how it changed that. And it really massively increased taxes on high earners and actually cut direct taxes on people on average kinds of earnings. Now, you won't hear either the Conservatives or the Labour Party saying that because it's clearly not in their interest to do so. But that's what's happened. And again, I think this is related to the political difficulty of actually increasing taxes on people on average earnings for very obvious reasons, given they haven't had a pay rise for 15 or 20 years. So you can see where the politics of this are going. But the economics, it's really quite hard, I think, to argue you could get very significant additional revenues in an economically undamaging way from high earners, certainly.
The best thing about getting to host a show like this is being able to sit opposite some of the most interesting talkers, thinkers, doers in Britain. And what better example do we have of that than the Spectator's very own Rory Sutherland? He joined me just a few weeks ago to talk about everything from the inheritocracy, the housing crisis, to whether he was going to leave any money to his niece. Let's have a look at that episode. If you were the inhabitant of number 11 Downing Street and you were about to make your budget, what would be the one measure that you would bring in?
Oh, land value tax.
Your land value tax. Yep.
It's very difficult to get people to understand it because it's an idea that is at the same time left-wing and right-wing, in that it regards land and the ownership of land. Effectively, it treats it almost in a socialistic way, which is that you are, to some extent, albeit at a very small scale, renting the land on which your house sits from the government.
Yeah.
In exchange, you pay very little tax on anything else. So as a result, a bottle of 15-year-old Highland Park would only cost £7.50. So you wouldn't really care how much tax you pay.
Sure, we can all get behind that.
Okay, so this is the idea of the single tax. I wouldn't take it to that purist extent. But I would start to introduce a shot across the bows to the suggestion that if you think that basically the best home for your money is in property, you better think again.
Yeah.
Because, by the way, working in advertising, you always notice things that are advertised without anybody actually paying to advertise them. And the most extraordinary thing over the last 40 years, every single case where property prices went up, the news media presented that as a good news story. Now, no one says great news if you've got half a tank of petrol in your car, petrol prices again. Okay? It should be a use good.
Yeah.
And instead, it's increasingly either a positional good or it's effectively an investment good. And there isn't a problem if you have a Dutch tulip bubble, because I can then go, well, these tulips are a bit overpriced. I think I'll just, I'll divert to gladioli. Okay,
yeah.
Right. Well, let's try lupins.
Yeah.
The problem with property is it's something that people, unlike tulips, people fundamentally can't do without. And so by creating this extraordinary investment class of what is an essential, you've created an economy which is basically extractive.
Yeah.
We need Gary Stevenson on. He's kind of, but my point also being that, economists are generally very mean, boring people.
Yes.
And therefore they sanctify saving and, deferred gratification. But my only problem with that is that it isn't deferred gratification that keeps the economy humming. It's people who actually earn money and then go and spend it on stuff.
Yeah.
What you will see is that I think the top, let me get this right, something like the top decile of the population earn 14 times more than the bottom decile, but they only spend 4 times as much.
Right.
And so the rest of it, once you earn above a certain level, effectively, it's now getting funneled into a ludicrous property Ponzi scheme, which fundamentally needs to be burst.
Yep.
And I would incidentally, I'd reduce tax on the higher rate of taxation, because I think the extent to which, a hardworking small percentage of the population are basically funding large numbers of people to do bugger all, and I include retirees in that as much.
Oh, absolutely.
People, okay, right. I mean, this sanctification of retirement is ridiculous. Okay, if I go and say, "Oh, I'd like to take 2 years off work and bum around Asia," people go, "No, that's terribly awkward, Rory. You really can't do that. It's absolutely impossible." But if I leave it, if I then decide I'm going to leave work at 62 and bum around on a golf course, that's apparently completely marvelous and deserves nothing other than our own admiration.
Yes.
And so, there is this very, very strange thing about the extent to which saving, and you've effectively created a government that's gerontophile. It's not the paedophilia crisis in politics that's the problem. It's the gerontophile crisis, which is that you cannot do anything that disquiets pensioners in any shape or form. Now, just to be clear, okay, as well as having VAT for all pension, 100% VAT for pensioners on Saturdays and Sundays, what the hell are they doing shopping at the weekend? Right? They've had the rest of the week. Right? It's worth noting that although any pensioner can make a sob story in the Daily Mail, retirees every year in the UK spend 30 billion on leisure and travel. So that 30 billion hole, if you just put 100% VAT on cruises.
Yeah.
Basically, so there are an awful lot of retirees who aren't particularly deserving.
Yeah.
They're not Captain Tom. They didn't fight in World War II. They went to the goddamn Isle of Wight festival. And yet we treat old people with a kind of reverence, which I think was entirely worthy and deserved in terms of the generation born in 1920, 1930, 1940. I think it gets increasingly dubious about people who are born in 1958.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, but it's just
No. I think we'll have to do a whole episode on that specific issue.
No. Let's screw over I'm 60. I should be taking their side.
Yeah.
But at the age of 60, I've paid off my mortgage. My children have largely left home, although I still have to help them with their rent. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I get a senior rail card. What the hell? There should be a rail card for beleaguered people in their 30s who actually have a job, right? For goodness sake.
Yeah.
But I think this gerontophilia in government is something we do need to address, because there are an awful lot of these people who are actually asset very rich.
Yeah.
And then what happens is you get to a certain age and you become paranoid about holding on to your assets. So there's a wonderful finding from, I think it was Investec. If you don't downsize voluntarily before you're 72, you'll never do it except under duress. So there should be a stamp duty holiday for people between the ages of like 68 and 74.
For downsizing. Sure.
Which basically says, get out now.
Yep. Goodbye.
The other question, by the way, inheritance tax makes no allowance for how many kids you have or whether you have kids.
Yeah.
Now, I get the fact that I'd quite like to leave a few, 100,000 or so to my daughters, because I invest a lot of money in bringing the buggers up in the post. I don't give a shit about my niece, right?
I hope you've enjoyed Reality Check as much as I've enjoyed making it. I want to give a special thank you to my executive producer, Natasha Feroz, who is the person that really brought this show into being. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're watching and listening, and enjoy the rest of your Christmas. Have the happiest of New Year's, and we'll be back in 2026.